Onwards to the next video, let's talk about social change, particularly when it comes to transitioning between major belief systems. For example, the transition between a republic and a monarchy, capitalism, socialism. It could be economic, political, or even somewhat cultural. With big changes, there are naturally many ways for it to be brought about, but the two main types for social change comes in two ways: rapid polarization and slow change over time. This is most acutely noted when it comes to transitions between dominant ideologies or beliefs in a state, because the state feels them more acutely. Because what is the state? Well, it is the bureaucratic apparatus managing a territory, and so changing who is in that bureaucracy naturally creates a big change for how a state is run and how one might perceive a state. For example, imagine transitioning between a slave-based economy and a feudal one. This did happen in our history around the fall of the Roman Empire, with the latifundia system and much of the slave-based economy of ancient Rome being replaced by the feudal economies that we see with the Franks, with the Lombards, with the Visigoths, etc. When we think of the start of feudalism, you have to remember that was a transitional state from the largely slave-based economies of ancient Rome, which, keep in mind, Rome had a massive amount of slaves. Like, percentage-wise, it had them well into the double digits. The United States, during the antebellum period even, did not come close to sheer percentage that Rome did. The antebellum South, one of the largest slave-based economies in the Victorian era, so the 1860s, did not have as many slaves per capita as ancient Rome. That is insane to think about, especially when you realize just how many millions were shipped over even before the US stopped its slave trade. And then you have to factor in, of course, the reproduction that just comes naturally with human beings. It is insane to really think about. But the feudal economy that we know of came from that. So when someone says, serfs were slaves, no, they weren't. They were an entire different category. It's really important to understand that, because it is one of the best examples of a change between dominant beliefs with a state. Before, usually the economy was based around slavery, and so you would have slave estates, sometimes tenant farmers, and then you would pay people low wages to work in the mines if you believed it was too high a mortality to be worth a slave. And of course, you would need people to run those estates for you if you weren't there, so of course, large landholders would hire their own people, or on occasion, they would actually hire their own slaves to do it for them. It's actually where we get the idea of vicarious living, because they would have a slave known as a vicarious who would manage an estate for their master. And so you go from that, a very centralized economic model based around a few main slave families, to a feudal system where a bunch of families would have their own territories and their own manors, where peasants would work the land and give part of their yield to the lord as basically a tax, and then eventually you would have larger established states like, for example, the Frankish kings, who would rule instead, where they would rule above the smaller lords who would pay tribute to them, and this would continue all the way down the feudal ladder. It was far more decentralized than the slave economies of the Roman Empire. Well, the ancient Roman Empire, Eastern Roman Empire actually adopted a similar feudal model. But it's a good example because, while yes, the fall of Rome was very much a polarized event with two main groups clashing against each other, the Romans and outsiders, the actual transition to feudalism, I'd argue, was a bit more of a slow change, with people looking for ways to defend themselves, and so local lords would set up manors in the manor system, protecting them in exchange for the tribute of food and coin in some cases. in exchange for protection, and thus feudalism would establish itself over time. It was not an immediate transition. But let's look at some historical examples for both outside of just that. For polarization, I'll give two main examples. The French Revolution is a very good one for polarization because that's basically what happened. You had two groups, traditionalists and revolutionaries. Now, the king was largely in the middle. He did want some change to preserve the state, but he often got overruled by the clergy and the nobility, and so he couldn't make the necessary changes to balance the budget, leading to clashes between the traditionalists and the reformers, who would eventually become the revolutionaries, and overthrow the French government. Essentially, stress came on the state, the people were worried, and with such a heavy burden, people went to extremes and then clashed. And in the case of the French Revolution, the revolutionaries won, but they got pushed back because traditionalists would later crush them. This is where we get the, how do I explain this? The Metternich system, which if you know what that is, or just can Google it, it's basically the post-Napoleonic setup of Europe. Essentially, revolutionaries came in due to polarization, and then as they tried to expand, the counter-revolution, or the traditionalists, pushed back and set things back further from the position that the revolutionaries were trying to achieve. The Meiji reforms, on the other hand, are another good example of polarization, but they were fully successful and weren't pushed back. Emperor Meiji, of course, was the leader of Japan for the first parts of what we would now think of as the modern Japanese Empire. See, previously, under the Tokugawa shogunate, the Japanese state was very backwards compared to much of Europe, particularly in its reliance on feudalism and old structures. However, Emperor Meiji revolted from the shogun, who ostensibly was under him. Frankly, that entire situation is weird on so many levels, because technically the emperor was above and shogun below, but the shogun was ruling. Whole thing, regardless. Meiji came in, overthrew the Tokugawa government, and established the new Empire of Japan. He moved the capital to Edo, which would be known as Tokyo, or the Eastern Capital, and he did a lot of rapid reforms in an attempt to modernize the state. Reforming the army, reforming the navy, building up railroads, modernizing the economy, and doing a number of things in an effort to effectively modernize the Japanese state so it could keep up with Europe. This is where we get a lot of the big companies, like Mitsubishi. Which, weird side note, look into all the companies, like what they would call the Zaibatsu. They are in so many different industries. It's honestly kind of crazy when you think of it from an American perspective, because in the US, at least you can have like a thread that connects every business that most do. Like, for example, Standard Oil had railroads, but it was largely in the oil business, either refining, producing, whatever. There is a company that produces cars and paper simultaneously, one of the Zaibatsu. It's kind of insane. But yeah, that's just a tangent. Back to the more important topic and why I bring this up. See, that's a good example of polarization. There was a clash between two main groups. Meiji, who wanted to westernize and rapidly catch up with the West, and the shogun, who, well, they did want to catch up with the West. At that point with Japan, there was no real question that they were going to have to. They wanted to keep the old order and the structure with samurai and daimyo and all that. That's essentially what they wanted to do. And so, when they couldn't agree, they got polarized, and then they clashed, and one overthrew the other. But if you want a good example of slow change, I would go with England, Great Britain, UK, whatever you want to call it, because technically speaking, we're talking about the whole timeline. So, we're talking pre-Active Union, post-Active Union, and then the bringing in of Ireland, which is now Northern Ireland, into the United Kingdom. But England, throughout its history, was very much on the case of slow change. There were exceptions, of course, the English Civil War as a big example, but even then, after the Civil War, the UK went right back to doing what it does best. Just existing. And with a lot of its reforms, they would happen over time, increasing the amount of people eligible to vote, just adding the House of Commons, which, by the way, was not in most of the actual documents that people would call the English Constitution, like the Magna Carta. There is no House of Commons. The Commons came later and was a example of slow change, with the people wanting more representation, so the British allowed it, granted them the Commons, and so allowed certain people to vote, and eventually you'd get the Commons, with that later expanding who was allowed to vote over time with the Chartists and other groups pushing for it. Same with slavery. Its abolition was a slow one in the UK, but it was very much something that still happened. The UK essentially kept a steady course, slowly changing over time to adapt to things as they came. It wasn't a rapid change like, for example, the French had, again and again and again. Instead, they just changed things over time and adapted as necessary. But of course, the question then becomes, who of course uses these? Because yes, polarization and slow change are easy to understand on the basis. When it comes to the basics, but who actually uses these? Well, a big one for polarization is accelerationists. They are those who actively use polarization to achieve political ends. Think of it like this. If you want outcome A, but you know no one's going to accept unless you're at position B, and position B is the opposite of what you want, what an accelerationist will do is they will rapidly run to position B and push for that, knowing that in the rebound, they'll end up at position A. Or at least hoping that's what will happen. Essentially, they think of it like a metronome effect where if they accelerate in one direction, they'll come back even quicker on the other side. So they try to actively use political polarization to achieve their own ends. So if they want peace, they're going to push for a world war. If they want socialism, they're going to push for rapid capitalism. And if they want a chair, then they're going to stand. It's not always logical, but that's essentially what it is in a political sense. Doing the opposite to achieve your end goal. Meanwhile, when you think of slow change, the best way to think about it is people who one might call reformers. You may not always agree with them, hence why I put the quotes, but that's the whole idea. The idea is slow change over time to achieve a goal. Whether it be gun control, segregation, or civil rights, or really any change in how the state governs over time with incremental changes. That's what reformers push for, and that's what they do. They slowly change things. It's not always an immediate thing. In fact, it rarely is. But that's the basic idea behind it when it comes to reform. It's the idea that, hey, things ain't perfect now, but if we change these things slightly, we can get them closer to how we actually want them. Now, does that mean you necessarily have to agree with them or that reform is the right way to go? No, it doesn't. In some cases, it is legitimately better to have immediate change, even if brutal. That's not to say it's good that blood has to be spilled, but sometimes you legitimately don't have any other option. After all, Nazi Germany, easy example of it. There ain't really a way to handle that with slow change. You either gotta remove the fascists, or accept that you're being ruled by fascists. But of course, if things are decent, like let's take the United States now. The United States now still has plenty of things that I would actually argue for more severe changes, especially when it comes to the budget. But for a lot of things, slow change is better. Why? The US is not in a Nazi Germany situation. It's not in such a totalitarian state that the only option is violent overthrow. And so, it is better to change things over time, adjusting as need be to get things closer to where we actually want it. Some quick changes can be made that are more severe or significant, but generally I would argue for reform, not revolution. Especially because, as much as many people hate to acknowledge it, our government, when it was first established, was far closer to the British government we had just left than honestly most people even comprehend. Think about it. Bicameral legislature, like the British. We had a executive with limited power, like the king after the English Civil War. And, of course, we had courts and a judicial system, which, while the UK had them as well, I'm not as knowledgeable on their own, so I can't say whether or not they were independent or not. But very much common law based, both of them were. The United States, for as much as many people like to call it the American Revolution, it really was just a war for independence. There wasn't much massive change, honestly, between the policies other than changing the fact that we were now allowed to expand westward. And, of course, who we paid taxes to. Legitimately, the US was far less revolutionary than many people give it credit for. But it still has proven successful, at least in my eyes, in terms of what it's done for the United States. Much like the British, we have tended to focus on slow change. Other than the few times, like, for example, the 1920s with the Great Depression, where it was far more polarizing, or earlier in the 1860s with the Civil War, which led to the Radical Republicans gaining power, and thus the push for abolition and eventually the clashes between segregation or integration. The United States has largely tried its best to keep a steady hand and focus on slow change. And that has benefited it very much. Yes, its position is great and its economy can develop well no matter what government's running it, but its steady hand and reliable state has allowed it to grow even more than it otherwise would have. The US benefited from slow change and reform rather than revolution. So it's important to recognize when true political polarization becomes absolutely necessary, and you basically have to pick who you're going to back immediately, or whether or not you want to change things over time slowly. And even rapid polarization is rarely immediate. The Nazis themselves rose because of polarization. But it wasn't an immediate thing. It happened over a few years. Don't expect things to happen instantly, especially if you want it to be stable and last. If you rush things without a plan, you're going to hit a wall. And so when it comes down to it, just remember that. And remember to choose which is best given the situation. Do you think necessarily we need rapid change and the instability that comes with it? Or is it better to slowly change and adapt our course steady as she goes? I leave that up to you. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed.